Namaste and good morning, and welcome to the Vedanta Society of Greater Houston and our Sunday service. Om Yo Brahmanam Vidadhati Purvam Yo Vai Vedangscha Prahinoti Tasmai Tam Hadevam Atma Buddhi Prakasham Mumukshurvai Sharanamaham Prapadye. We who seek liberation take refuge in that infinite light which illuminates the hearts of all, which is the source of the Creator himself and the repository of infinite knowledge, Veda. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat. Om Peace, peace, peace be unto us all. So this morning, the topic is one in the series on basic concepts of Vedanta. And today, the concept we will take up is the concept of knowledge. What is knowledge in a Vedantic context? Jnanam, or knowledge. Jnanam in Sanskrit. So as I say at the beginning of every lecture in this series, and as I will probably continue to say in future lectures on the series, there's always a need for examining our basic concepts because there are many things, probably most things in our experience that we think that we know. That actually when we start to think about them, we don't know what they are at all. It's part of the basic ignorance in which the ocean of ignorance in which we find ourselves. And sometimes the more basic the concept, the more frequently used, the more apparently obvious the concept, the less we actually know about it, because we have from an early time assumed we knew what the concept was because we're dealing with it and talking about it all the time. But when we come down to actually examining it, we find that no, I don't understand it at all. And so that is certainly true with the concept of knowledge. To take another one, the concept of myself, who I am, my own self-existence. That's the most basic concept we have. It's the concept which underlies all other concepts. The concept or the self-perception reduced to the concept of self, who I am. And we live with ourselves all of our lives. There's no one else closer to us than our own self, who we are. And yet, when we actually examine who am I, we have very little knowledge of who I am. And so, again, there's a need for examining basic concepts, including the most basic. And then especially that is especially true when we come to concepts from another tradition, a tradition like the Vedanta tradition, which comes from such a different source as our own tradition, the Western tradition, then there's a special need to examine the concept. Because it's true that in every language you can, in some way or another, approximate an expression of anything that's said in another language. But sometimes there's a word in a language which doesn't have a corresponding word in another language, and you may have to use a whole paragraph to explain what that word means, but you can do that. Words in which concepts are enshrined, a word is a signifier of a concept. Words cover different amounts of ground. Sometimes in one language to another, the words for the same thing, they may overlap, but then they cover a slightly different amount of a slightly different field of the ground of experience. And so that's especially true when you come to widely different languages, or languages from widely different cultural experiences, like that between the traditional Western experience and the traditional Indian experience. So, of course, in the West, there is a long philosophical tradition. As Swami Vivekananda said, and many others have said, Western thought really is a continuation of Greek thought. Greek thought itself had its antecedents, but the first flowering of real philosophy in the West, as far as we know, happened in Greece. Yes, there was philosophical thought in Egypt also, and that certainly influenced Greek culture. And Greece had other influences as well. But the first full flowering of independent philosophical inquiry, that is, thinking purely in rational terms to understand by rational analysis our experience and put it in terms of universal principles rather than in terms of mythology, stories, etc. That in the West had its first full flowering in Greece. In fact, the famous modern philosopher, not modern as in our day today, but in the 20th, early 20th century, Alfred North Whitehead, a very influential philosopher, an associate of Bertrand Russell, late 19th and 20th century. He said that Western philosophy consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. There's a famous statement of Alfred North Whitehead that Western philosophy really is a series of footnotes to Plato, consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. Showing the extraordinary importance of Plato. So he said that all of the whole development of Western philosophy can be considered as a series of footnotes to Plato. So yes, much of Western philosophy disagrees with Plato on practically everything. But what he meant was that it's either taking inspiration from Plato or a response to Plato. So even Plato's own student, you could almost say disciple, though there was not quite that formality of a relationship, but still the student-teacher relationship was very strong at that time in Greece also. Aristotle, his philosophy was quite different from Plato's philosophy, and yet his philosophy itself was a reaction to what he had learned from his teacher. And so, again, we have this continuous development of thought in Western philosophy from the time of Plato. And again, Plato, of course, had Socrates, his teacher, and Socrates had other teachers. But Plato is the large, looming figure over Western philosophy. So, India has an even longer philosophical tradition than the West. Now, I've heard Western philosophers say that India has no true philosophy. Now, that's very easy to say. How can you come to that conclusion that India has no true philosophers? You can define philosophy in such a way that it excludes everything but your own. So yes, depending on how you define philosophy, you can define it in such a way that India is discarded. And so this particular philosopher, and he's a respectable philosopher and a respected philosopher, he made that statement that in India there is no true philosophy because to him, philosophy means constantly questioning, doubting, analyzing, not coming to a conclusion. If you come to a conclusion, then immediately you have to question that and doubt that and analyze it and never accept a conclusion. So to him, the philosophical mind is that which is always doubting, questioning, never accepting a conclusion. And of course, you find that is one of the problems that has led to the degeneration of philosophy in the West and why science has taken the place of philosophy. Science is a great enterprise, a great field of inquiry. But philosophy also is a great field of inquiry, and it has its own sphere, different from science. Yes, as I said before, many concepts overlap, and so the fields of science and of philosophy, they overlap in certain areas, but they are different fields. They're different, using different tools, searching for different things. Searching for understanding, yes, but understanding of what? And so in the West, philosophy has one of the causes, not the only, causes of the degeneration of philosophy in the West, so that it has become mainly just a handmaiden of science and busies itself largely, for many philosophers, not all, but many philosophers, it busies itself just with the analysis of language and concepts. That has happened because philosophy never came to any conclusions. One philosopher would present a philosophy, a rational explanation of the experience of existence, and another philosopher would come along and pick holes in it and show the flaws in that philosophy. And then someone would come and pick holes in that philosopher's conclusions. And so philosophy continued for 2,500 years in the West without coming to any conclusions. A few things, a few basic things are understood, but almost every conclusion of a philosopher can be questioned. In India, they didn't approach philosophy in that way. In India, as has often been pointed out, the word for philosophy itself is extremely revealing. The word for philosophy is darshana. And darshana means seeing. And so philosophy in India was seen as a rational analysis of experience. In the West, yes, that is there in philosophy in the West, but in the West, it was largely trying with the rational mind to understand this universe and put it into a conceptual framework. But there was not the idea of understanding, a totality of understanding. But in India from ancient times, the idea was, how can you have a philosophy of existence, of reality, of truth, of a philosophy that covers the universe of experience, if you don't have complete experience, if your experience itself is partial, if you're only examining experience from one small viewpoint. And so the Indian idea of philosophy was to get a comprehensive view of reality. And then through darshana, through seeing, through experiencing a comprehensive view of reality, then put that into a system that can be communicated in rational terms to another mind. That is what philosophy is according to the Hindu tradition. Not that you'll find that definition as the way that I've stated it somewhere. That's my own definition, but consistent with what the tradition did. So again, in the West, philosophy was largely an exercise of an ordinary person, but a person who's well informed or well educated and intellectually very competent, who tried to explain experience from their standpoint. But in India, it was understood, especially when you get to Vedanta, but even other philosophies understood that philosophy to be true, a true representation in rational terms of the universe of experience, that experience has to be comprehensive. You have to see, it has to explain the levels of experience, and it has to explain not just the waking state, but the dream state, the deep sleep state, the whole feel, and states of meditation, states of altered consciousness. All of that has to go into the formulation of a philosophy. So to be a philosopher in India meant to be a real philosopher. Yes, there are plenty of professional philosophers in India and always have been, those who are pundits who study the works of others, memorize them, get the basic concepts, and then teach them to others. That's sort of the idea of philosophy in the West. But real philosophers, those who founded systems that lasted through the ages, were supposed to be people who had profound, altering experiences of reality, where they came back from those states and could explain the totality of experience from a superior, comprehensive perspective. So this strength of Indian philosophy is that it sought to be based on experience. And yes, even in Indian philosophy, there are different levels of experience. And so you see the Charvakas, that they figure in very early Indian philosophy, and then they sort of disappeared. But the Charvakas were a very crude form of materialists, who believed that there was nothing but physical matter, and the purpose of life was just to enjoy the senses. It was a very crude form of hedonistic philosophy. And then there's Nyaya and Vaisheshika. Nyaya is very highly developed logic, in some ways more developed than much more developed than the Aristotelian logic. But it was basically interested in logical analysis, the logical processes of thought. And Vaisheshika, which was interested in how the universe was created, and there was the theory of atoms and all of that. And so you have in India also philosophies which are lower and philosophies which are higher, that is, from a higher standpoint. Of course, what I would consider, and many would consider, the lower philosophies, they didn't consider themselves as lower. They considered that they were right and everybody else was wrong, just as philosophers have always done. But at least they were trying to get a comprehensive view of reality. But when you examine the whole field of Indian philosophy, you can see that they form different levels. At the bottom level, the two traditional philosophies of Nyaya and Vaisheshika, they dealt with logic and the nature of the physical matter. And then above that, Sankhya and Yoga, which dealt with the mind. And then Mimamsa and Vedanta, they dealt with metaphysics. So they were the highest, and Vedanta dealing with the highest aspect of metaphysics. So, so the strength of Indian philosophy is that they were explaining experience, and so they did come to conclusions. And they did because those conclusions were based on experience. And if you could reach an experience which explained all other experiences, which was so comprehensive that all other viewpoints were seen as partial from that viewpoint, then, of course, you would have arrived at the supreme experience. And so that's what Vedanta claims to have done, and we'll get to that in a little while. Another weakness in Western philosophy was expressed by Bertrand Russell, though he expressed it as a strength, but I would see it, and the Indian tradition would see it as a weakness. Bertrand Russell said that a philosopher should never believe, should never try to follow, should never try to practice his own philosophy, because if he were to do that, he would lose objectivity. That is, one's philosophy should be something out there that you can look at as an object and examine, and never invest yourself in it, because then you lose objectivity. So that's part of that Western fascination with the idea of objectivity. I have to be here and I have to observe that as an object, be objective about it, not get emotionally involved in it, and then I can see its good points and bad points. And so it should remain there. The Vedantic or the Hindu idea, not just Vedantic, but the Hindu idea is quite different, that philosophy is to be lived because it is a darshana. It's a way of seeing. And so you should so identify with the philosophy that you come to see reality in the terms of the philosophy. Not through hypnosis, not by telling yourself over and over again that this is true until the mind gives in and says, okay, I might as well just accept it as true, and so now I believe it. No, not a matter of belief, but following the disciplines and the practices of the philosophy to come to the point where you actually see that reality is of that nature. And so there you are to internalize the philosophy in the Indian context, whereas here in the West, you're to objectify it and keep it out there. So, of course, both have their virtues, but the if we want to know the truth, and that's the search of Indian philosophy, to know the truth, with the idea that there is a truth to be known, then it can only be known subjectively. One of the main problems in the West today is a result of this whole Western tradition of thought. It didn't culminate until the modern times, and that's why one of several reasons I keep saying in different lectures that the old paradigms that have supported Western civilization are now dead. In fact, the paradigms that have supported civilizations around the world are now dead largely. Uh, the paradigm of objective truth that we don't identify with, but we keep questioning and doubting, that has led to the idea that there's no such thing as truth. There are many truths, and truths mean just different perspectives, but there's no thing called truth. They're nothing but perspectives. You think one way, you see things one way, I see them another. There's nothing binding all of that together, so there's no truth to be attained. And so the very concept of truth has become relativized to where it's no truth at all. If everyone has their own truth, if everyone just however you see things, that's the way, that's equally valid to any other way of seeing it, it really means there is no truth. They're just different opinions, just different, everybody's living in their own world. But no, Hinduism was in search of truth. And so it was seeking conclusions, not just the things that could always be doubted, because that leads to the modern philosophical impasse where there's no such thing as truth. So let me read a couple of passages about the concept of knowledge. First is from Merriam-Webster, the dictionary, defining knowledge. There are several definitions. I'll read a partial list of the definitions of knowledge according to Merriam-Webster. Acquaintance with or understanding of a science, art, or technique. So knowledge is an acquaintance with a science, an art, or a technique. Or it is the fact or condition of being aware of something. I have knowledge of something. That is, I'm aware of something. It's the range of one's information or understanding. I answered it to the best of my knowledge. That is, I have a store of understanding about things, so I answered your question to the best of my knowledge. So that's another meaning. The fact or condition of having information is also a definition of knowledge. The sum of what is known, the body of truth, information and principles acquired by humankind. So the whole body of knowledge of humankind, all of those things that are known by human beings. So you see that the emphasis is on things known, what is known, objects and processes, etc. Then Wikipedia says similarly, knowledge is a familiarity, an awareness or understanding of someone or something, such as facts, which is propositional knowledge, or skills, procedural knowledge, how do you do this, or objects, acquaintance knowledge, I know this object. By most accounts, knowledge can be acquired in many different ways and from many sources, including but not limited to perception, reason, memory, testimony, scientific inquiry, education, and practice. So again, you see that the emphasis is on what is known. So yes, it's the fact of knowledge. He's a knowledgeable person, meaning that he is aware of many things, but still the emphasis, it's all on knowledge of things, in tune with the Western preoccupation with objective reality. So it's the whats and the hows of things, knowing what and knowing how. What means knowing things, and how means procedures. So when we come to Vedanta, there's a very different concept of knowledge. a number of years ago, that is in 1995, I was invited to a international philosophical conference in Calcutta at our own Ramakrishna Mission Institute of Culture. They'd invited well-known philosophers from all over the world, from Europe, from Australia, from North America. There were only two or three, about three of us Swamis, and all of the other large conference were professional philosophers. And so we each had to present our papers, and then there would be discussion and challenges and so forth. It was a very interesting process. But Gerald Larson, a friend who passed away just 2-3 years ago, I believe. He was a philosopher, an academic, well known in the world as an expert in Sankhya philosophy of India. Though he was an ordained Presbyterian minister, but in his professional life, he was a professor and taught Indian philosophy, specializing in Sankhya philosophy. So he challenged the people kept talking about knowledge in the conference, those from an Indian background. And he challenged the concept of knowledge. And it was obvious that he was challenging it because he saw knowledge as knowledge of things. And they were speaking of knowledge from the Indian standpoint, which is what I'm going to deal with now. So that was where I first became aware of this conflict. This was back in 1995. Suddenly it was one of those flash moments where I understood, yes, this is a problem with the use of knowledge. So now when we come to Jnana Yoga, before I had joined, but just 2 or 3 months before I joined the order. I had never been to a center. I'd only read a few books of Vedanta. And one of the books I was reading at that time, just before going to Chicago to join the order, was a wonderful book by Swami Prabhavananda called The Spiritual Heritage of India. For those who want an easily accessible summation of the schools of Indian philosophy, that's a wonderful book. Because it's easy to understand, and yet it tells about the various schools of Indian philosophy. And so in there it told about the path of Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge. And it explained, of course, that Bhakti Yoga was the path of love for God as person, the path of devotion to the personal God, the path of Karma Yoga, the path of selfless service, the path of Raja Yoga, stilling the mind in meditation. And then the path of Jnana Yoga was presented as the path of philosophy. And reading that, I was so excited because I thought, well, meditation is difficult. I've never had a meditation teacher, I thought to myself at that time. But I've tried to meditate in my own way, and I know that that is difficult. And I don't feel that much devotion. And I'm not interested in karma yoga, the path of action. But I'm a good student. I'm intelligent. I'm a good student. So if there's a path of philosophy where by learning the philosophy I can attain to liberation, then that's for me. That, again, was a mistaken concept brought on by my own ignorance. I thought that Jnana Yoga, being the path of philosophy, meant that by studying philosophy intellectually, I would come to a point of understanding where suddenly the truth would flash and I would be liberated. No, the path of knowledge is sometimes called the path of philosophy. Swami Vivekananda called it the path of philosophy because philosophy is used to give you the basic understanding, but that's not what liberates you. That gives you the foundation for practice. The practice comes through an intense effort to penetrate through the experiential cloud of ignorance which covers the minds of all of us. And so it takes intense spiritual effort, not conceptual effort. It takes a continual effort of the mind to pierce through the veil of ignorance. So again, that points to the conflict between the Vedantic understanding of knowledge and the Western understanding of knowledge. In Vedanta, it's ignorance which is the cause of our bondage, ignorance which is the cause of all of our misery. So if we were using knowledge and ignorance in the same way as Vedanta uses it, then a person like Einstein or Hawkins, who died in recent years, people like that who were such geniuses, they should be the closest to liberation. But no, we're talking about a different type of ignorance. Not ignorance being the cause of our bondage doesn't mean lack of intellectual knowledge. No, it means a cosmic cloud which has clouded our understanding, which is not conceptual understanding. It's the very fact of our thinking that I am an individual separate from this universe, and that I am here and the universe is outside of me, and that I am a body and mind. It's as existential ignorance. And Jnana Yoga says that if ignorance is the cause of our bondage and all of our suffering, all of our problems are caused by ignorance, then knowledge is the solution to that. So again, we find that highly learned people, they're not more successful in getting over suffering than ignorant people. And so knowledge here must be different from the knowledge which is the object of our concept of knowledge. The concept of knowledge must, or the fact of knowledge, must be very different from our understanding of knowledge. Jesus said in the Christian Bible that ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. So that's a very Vedantic statement. Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. Of course, in conventional Christianity, that has come to mean you know that Jesus is your Savior, and that will set you free, as if it were so easy. That just by believing in Jesus and saying that I believe in Jesus without even knowing what believing means, just saying that, well, I believe Jesus is my Savior, and so I'm forgiven and I will be free when I die. Oh, no, it's not so easy. That again is substituting the Western concept of knowledge for the concept Jesus was giving of knowing the truth. So in the Upanishads, we find that Brahman itself is defined as Satyam Jnanam Anandam Brahma. Brahma, the infinite reality, is Satyam, truth, Jnanam, knowledge, Anantam, infinity. So Brahman, the infinite reality, is truth, knowledge, and infinity. So again, what does knowledge mean? Does it mean that Brahman is like a vast library where there's all of this information? No, it doesn't mean information at all. So that's what we have to understand today, what is meant by knowledge there. Satyam, truth. Brahman is truth, Satyam. That's a very interesting Sanskrit word. It comes from the same source. It comes from us, dhatu. Us means to be, and it's related to the English is and are. So us, to be. And so Sat is existence, that which is Sat. And Satyam is that which is isness. So truth is what? Truth is that which is. Truth is that which is real. And real means that which is. So truth, isness, reality, they're all the same thing. So Satyam, meaning truth or reality or isness, truth, knowledge, which we'll come to, and infinity. That is the very nature of Brahman. So again, what does knowledge mean here? And then in the Mundaka Upanishad, it begins, not the very first verse, but it's second or third, begins with the disciple coming to the teacher and asking, Kasminnu bhagavo vijñate sarvamidam vijñatam bhavatiti. So what is that, O revered sir, by knowing which everything here becomes known? So a wonderful question. It looks at first like a ridiculous question, but no, it's a wonderful question. What is that by knowing which everything here becomes known? That's the very search for Vedanta, finding that one knowledge by which everything is known. But that's not a conceptual knowledge. That's not an idea. It's not the unified field theory of physics, which seeks to explain all of the forces in nature by one theory. No, this is knowing one thing, one experience, one reality by which everything here becomes known. So, what is that knowledge? And then the teacher answers the disciple to that question, what is that, O revered sir, by knowing which everything here becomes known? The teacher begins his answer by saying, Dve vidye veditavye, paracha iva paracha. There are indeed, he says, two knowledges, the lower knowledge and the higher knowledge. Para, higher, chaiva, as well as aparacha, and the lower knowledge. So that we'll come to again in just a moment. And then you find it's not in the Upanishads, but taking all of the Upanishad teachings together, there was the later Vedantic formulation of the definition of Brahman, similar to Satyam, Jnanam, Anandam, Brahma. Brahman is truth, knowledge, and infinity. But they came up with Satchidananda, that which all of you have surely heard if you know anything about Vedanta. Satchidananda is the definition of Brahman, or the indicator of Brahman, rather. Existence, knowledge, and bliss, or existence, consciousness, and bliss. And I'll explain as we come to it why neither consciousness nor knowledge is actually the correct concept. The English words consciousness and knowledge are not the correct concepts for jnanam. So Satchidananda, Swami Vivekananda, came to this country as the first real Vedantic teacher. There had been a few translations which had been coming to this country from the early 1800s. In fact, Thomas Jefferson had in his library early translations of the Gita and I believe the Vishnu Purana and Manusmriti. That Sir William Jones. Gosh, I should remember that. I knew it so well. I think it's Sir William Jones was first to translate Sanskrit texts into English. He was sent to India as a punishment for having supported the American Revolution. He was a Britisher. He was sent to India as punishment, and he was the High Court judge. But he was also a linguist by avocation. And so he took up the study of Sanskrit, and he was the one who discovered the connection between Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, and then the Indo-European family of languages. So he did the first translations with the help of scholars, and so Thomas Jefferson, and then later the American transcendentalists, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and others had translations of some of the early Sanskrit works also. So Swami Vivekananda, when he came, he was really the first authentic Vedantic teacher from India to come. So some of the teachings had preceded him through the transcendentalists, but they were again working from translations and secondary sources. But Swamiji had the task of translating this ancient system and its wisdom into English. And so he translated Satchidananda as existence, knowledge, bliss. Nowadays, you'll see people translating it as existence, consciousness, and bliss. And I'll admit that that's probably a better translation, though that also is flawed. The problem with Swamiji's translation, or with the more popular translation now of knowledge or consciousness, is that neither word applies to what is meant in the Sanskrit context, in the Vedantic context. So Swamiji used knowledge. Why? Well, again, as I said, neither consciousness nor knowledge is accurate. Knowledge, again, in English, refers, as you can see from the definitions that I read from Merriam-Webster and from Wikipedia, the emphasis is on things known. What is knowledge itself? That's not approached. That's not talked about. But knowledge is referred to the things that are known, or the awareness of things, the awareness of objects, persons, procedures, etc. But again, emphasis on the content of knowledge. And so that's the problem with knowledge, because here, existence, knowledge, bliss, Brahman as knowledge doesn't have anything to do with content. In Brahman, there is no content, there's no thing there. There are no facts, there are no processes, there are no procedures, there are no persons. So who knows what? There's nothing to know in Brahman in that sense. So knowledge, which Swamiji used for a good reason, even though the word was, he had to use some English word. So even though the English word doesn't express what he intended, he was approximating. But consciousness also, which is more popular now, and in some ways it's a little better, but that also doesn't do justice to the term of Satchidananda, Chit in Satchidananda either, because consciousness in the West means consciousness of. What is consciousness in the West? Consciousness is conscious mental processes. That is, I'm thinking and I know that I'm thinking. And so that is consciousness, conscious thinking. That is thinking that is, and I have to use Vedantic concept to explain it, because you can't even explain it in English. The concept is so confused. The mental processes that I am aware of. I, as consciousness, am aware of the processes, but we don't make that distinction in Western thinking. Consciousness is the awareness and the processes all mixed together. That's why you get the ridiculous, absolutely absurd idea in modern AI, artificial intelligence, that if we can make computers complex enough, they will become self-aware. That's absolutely absurd. Yes, you may make computers far more complex than they are at present, where they can do much more, much faster than they do at present. But awareness is something else. Awareness isn't something that just suddenly pops out of complexity. Awareness has nothing to do with complexity. Awareness is the light which illuminates experience. It's a fact in itself, reality in itself. And so the Western word consciousness, or the same word in other languages, Western languages, the Western concept of consciousness, however you express it in whatever language, is also not what is spoken of as Chit, because Chit is speaking of the light of experience itself, which illuminates everything, but which itself needs nothing, which is reality itself. And so neither one of them, consciousness or knowledge, works properly. But he used knowledge for one of the reasons he used knowledge is that he was expanding the yogas, the path of jnana yoga, the path of knowledge, bhakti yoga, the path of love, karma yoga, the path of work and service, raja yoga, the path of psychic control, controlling of the mind. And so the traditional highest, most generalized human values, according to ancient Greek thinkers, classical Greek philosophy, were truth, goodness, and beauty. The same as expressed as the nature of God in Indian texts, Satyam Jnanam Satyam Shivam Sundaram. Satyam, truth, Shivam, goodness, Sundaram, beauty. Satyam, Shivam, Sundaram, truth, goodness, beauty. So those are the highest values as determined by the ancient Greek thinkers, the highest human values. And so jnanam, the path of knowledge, is the path of seeking for truth. And so the connection between knowledge and truth. Goodness, the karma yoga is the path of selfless service, which is the basis, the very foundation of goodness. And so the ideal of goodness. And bhakti yoga is the path of love, which is also the path of beauty, truth, goodness, and beauty. So the path of devotion is love, and love for the ideal, and so there you get the idea of beauty. Karma yoga, the path of goodness and service. You get the idea of work and service, the idea of goodness. In jnana, the path of knowledge. So there you get this search for truth. And in Raja Yoga, psychology, the control of the mind. It's through the mind that we know goodness, truth, goodness, and beauty. And so there you're coming to the control of the very instrument of value, of the experience of value. So again, there was a reason why a good reason for why he used knowledge, because of his effort and successful effort to expand the scope of the yogas, so that the 4 yogas go beyond even just the spiritual search and go to the search of all humankind in all aspects, all forms. Everyone, as the Greeks understood, is seeking for truth, goodness, and beauty. And doing it how? Through the mind. So the 4 yogas. Also, the path of jnana yoga is the path of seeking for the subject of all experience. Who am I? Bhakti yoga is seeking for the divine object, the ideal object, thou. Karma yoga is the yoga of engagement with the world, how to engage with the world in a way that leads me to freedom. And Raja Yoga is the path of the inward search, turning the mind inside. So Karma Yoga, engagement with the world, Raja Yoga, turning the mind within, Jnana Yoga, who am I? And Bhakti Yoga, who art thou, O divine ideal? So again, the 4 yogas are comprehensive of all human search and of all human ideals. So now in Vedanta, as I said before, there are 2 forms of knowledge that are recognized. As we saw when I quoted the Mundaka Upanishad, in answer to that question, what is that, O revered sir, by knowing which everything here becomes known? The teacher begins by explaining that there are 2 forms of knowledge, paracha iva paracha, the supreme as well as the lower knowledge. And so the lower knowledge, apara vidya, that's the knowledge, as this teacher goes on to explain, through which we know everything here. It's the knowledge of facts and of processes. The what's, I know the chair, I know the floor, I know what a cat is, I know what a dog is, I know what a human being is. Knowledge of things and knowledge of processes. I know how to sew, I know how to cook, I know how to sweep, etc. So the what's, which is knowledge of classification, and hows, which is knowledge of processes and procedures. Whereas paravidya, supreme knowledge, is the liberating knowledge. And that's where we come to the heart of what knowledge is, because that is knowledge itself. Paravidya, that through which we know the truth, and the truth shall set you free, as Jesus said, and as Vedanta long before that said. So the essence of knowledge, Vedanta means Veda Anta, the end of the Vedas, meaning the Upanishads, and the thought and philosophy and spiritual tradition coming out of the Upanishads. But Vedanta also means the end or the aim or the fulfillment of knowledge or the essence of knowledge. Vedanta Sara, Jnana Sara, the essence of knowledge, the fulfillment of knowledge, the end of knowledge. So in every act of knowledge, when I know something, there's the knower, I, the conscious knower. There's the object to which I know, and there is the knowledge itself. I know this cup. So I have to be there as a conscious perceiver. There's the object I perceive, the cup, and there is the experience of knowledge that can be expressed in the form of I know the cup. But that's neither the I nor the cup. That's the knowledge of the cup, which I express, I know the cup. It's got the subject and object, but it's expressing the fact of knowledge. I know the cup, where the knowing is the important part. So there's the subject of the knower, the known, and the knowledge, that experience of I know the cup. So in every act, there are these 3. Now, usually, as I've explained, knowledge, as we understand it, and even in India, in the Indian tradition also, most people by knowledge, they understand things that are known. And so that's why the teacher had to explain to his disciple in the Mundaka Upanishad that there's ordinary knowledge and there's supreme knowledge. Ordinary knowledge means that by which you know various things here, that by which you know everything here. So it's knowledge of things. So usually it's what is known that is emphasized by knowledge. But in Vedanta, the higher knowledge is knowing itself. Not as a verb, because again, we have the limitations of English, limitations of language, whether using English or French or Sanskrit, it doesn't matter. Language is limited. And so the emphasis is on the knowing itself, not as a verb, not as an action, not as a process, but the fact of knowing as a fact. So Swami Vivekananda makes a very interesting statement, which is supported by the Upadesha Sahasri, a wonderful text by Shankaracharya. Many people doubt many of the writings of the historicity of many of the writings of Shankaracharya. They think that many of the things attributed to him were written by later people and just attributed to Shankaracharya to make them accepted. But most scholars accept his commentaries on 10 of the Upanishads, on the Gita and Brahma Sutra as legitimately his, and the Upadesha Sahasri. Even those who doubt the Viveka Chudamani as his, which I don't see much reason to doubt that, but some people do. But the Upadesha Sahasri is almost universally accepted as his indeed. So Swamiji says about lower knowledge and higher knowledge, knowledge of things and the liberating knowledge, something which is echoed in the Upadesha Sahasri. He says, and this is in a lecture, or not a lecture, a writing of his in Bengali, which he contributed to the Udbodhan magazine. In English, it's known as knowledge, its source and acquirement. In Bengali, for those of you who are Bengali, it's Gyan Arjan. There is no doubt, he says, a great difference between apara and paravidya, lower knowledge, knowledge of things, and supreme knowledge, knowledge of reality. No doubt, a great distinction between the knowledge of this world and spiritual knowledge. The way of attaining the one may be different from the way of attaining the other. That is, the way that we learn about things here is different from the way we learn of reality itself. The way of attaining one may be different from the way of attaining the other. Dependence on a single method may not open the door to all types of knowledge. But this difference between the two, lower knowledge and higher knowledge, is only one of degree, only a difference of state, a difference in method necessitated by such a relative difference. Actually, it is one indivisible knowledge that pervades the whole universe from Brahma down to a clump of grass. That's the classical expression, from Brahma, the creator, down to a blade of grass, meaning everything in this universe. And so that's an extraordinary statement, that there's really no basic distinction between the lower knowledge and the higher knowledge. That all knowledge is basically the same. It's a question of degree. And that actually it is one indivisible knowledge that pervades the whole universe from Brahma down to a clump of grass. So again, existence, knowledge, bliss. In this understanding is true. But again, what does he mean by knowledge? What does he mean by this statement, that there's not really a distinction between the lower knowledge and the higher knowledge? He says in the lecture much later than this was written, in 1900, he says in the lecture given in San Francisco called Is Vedanta the Future Religion? He says that in my country, people will go down on their knees before one who knows the Vedas, but they don't care a fig for one who studies physics. But then Swamiji says, but this is not Vedanta. In Vedanta, all knowledge is sacred. So that's what he's speaking of here. The Upadesha Sahasri, which supports what Swamiji says, the knowledge produced by an evidence. That means knowledge of, by an evidence means things we know through the senses or through reasoning and so forth, ordinary knowledge. So let me substitute ordinary knowledge for that. Ordinary knowledge does not differ in its essential nature whether one calls it eternal or transitory. That is, there's not an essential difference between ordinary knowledge and knowledge of the eternal, knowledge of Brahman. So again, that's a very extraordinary statement, but a very confusing statement because of our understanding of what knowledge is. So I'm out of time now, but I'm not going to stop till I've completed the subject. Uh, how does knowledge take place from a Vedantic standpoint? The Vedantic psychology of knowing, how does it take place? The mind takes the form of whatever it is known. That sounds very confusing. It's not confusing at all. How do I know this room? My mind has taken the form of this room. That sounds like nonsense, very unscientific. My mind hasn't taken the form of the room. My mind is in the brain, and the light comes from the room through my eyes and up the optic nerve and registers in the brain, and I see this room. No. From a purely scientific analysis, that's absolutely wrong. You're not seeing the room. You're seeing the mind's creation of what has come through the optic nerve and up into the brain. The brain the mind takes the form of that information which has come in. And so what you see is the mind's reproduction. All you can see of the universe is the mind's creation of the universe. You're not seeing an external world at all. You're not feeling an external world. I don't feel this external table. That's all within my mind. Each of us experiences the world within the mind and nowhere else. And that's a necessary scientific conclusion. There's no way out of it, as well as a Vedantic philosophical conclusion. And so the mind takes the form of an object, and thereby we know it. And that form, when the mind takes the form of this room, because that's what I'm looking at now, and the mind is taking the form of that, presenting this to me as a picture within the mind, not out here. I don't see anything out here. I see it within the mind. The mind takes the form of that, and that is illuminated by consciousness. It's the light of consciousness reflected in the mind, which allows me to say, I see this hall. I see the chairs. I see the doors. I see the pictures on the wall. It's the light of consciousness which illuminates the form that the mind has taken as all of this. The light of consciousness reflected in the mind from the self, from the Atman, illuminates that picture within the mind, the image in the mind, and says, I know this. So the experience, I know, that it's said in Vedanta that, in fact, Shankaracharya says, that every experience of knowledge is non-dual. When the light of consciousness illuminates the form that the mind has taken, and I know this room, that's a non-dual experience. I know this room. The mind divides it into subject and object, but actually there's a non-duality to the identification with the knowledge. I know. So again, you see the emphasis here in Vedanta is not on what is known, it's on the experience I know. I sometimes give the example, the light bulb experience in a cartoon. When suddenly someone understands something in a cartoon, the bubble is shown with a light bulb in it to show, I understand. That is knowledge. When you have a mathematical problem and you don't know how to solve it, and then suddenly you have a flash, that's it. That is knowledge, not the thing that is known. And so for Vedanta, knowledge is the experience of knowing. It doesn't matter what is known, it's the experience of knowing. And that is a non-dual experience. That is always inside the self. It's not outside the self. It's not an object. It's the experience of knowing. So existence, knowledge, bliss. Knowledge is that awakened aha. And whenever we finally attain to the infinite knowledge, we know the infinite, it will be an infinite, eternal aha. So that is present in all experiences of knowing. The liberating knowledge is when the mind takes the form of the infinite and then dissolves into the infinite, because ignorance is destroyed when the mind takes the form of the infinite. And when ignorance is destroyed, the mind, which is a product of ignorance, that also merges into the infinite, from which is the only reality. So let me read in conclusion. I'll say just a word at the end to bring it all together, but practically concluding, I'll read from a statement in the Vedanta Sara, which I dealt with the last Sunday, the essence of Vedanta. This is a very high teaching, very difficult to understand, so don't expect to understand every word of what I'm saying, but this is something that when I was in a training center back in 1975, it would have been by 1976 when I was in the second year, that we studied Vedanta Sara. And I heard it at that time, and I got some understanding of it then, but it's something which has stayed with me ever since. And so there's a value to hearing these things, even if you don't yet understand it well. It says, when the student realizes the import of Tattvamasi, that is, the teacher teaches the student, Tattvamasi, thou art that. You, the individual, are the infinite reality. So when the student realizes the understanding that the teacher has given him, that you are that reality, there arises in his mind a state of absolute oneness in which he feels that he is Brahman. I am Brahman, aham brahmasmi. By nature, eternal, pure, self-illumined, free, real, supremely blissful, infinite, and one without a second. That mental state, illumined by the reflection of pure consciousness, takes the form of the Supreme Brahman, unknown but identical with the individual self, and destroys the ignorance pertaining to Brahman. So let me stop and just put it in other words, to make it a little bit more comprehensible. But again, this is something which is speaking of something so subtle that it'll be a long time before we understand it properly. So again, the teacher tells the disciple, Tattvamasi, you are that infinite reality. And then the disciple, whose mind has been prepared by long spiritual practice and long years of meditation and purification and so forth, the mind is now receptive and hears that teaching, and suddenly there flashes the knowledge, I am Brahman, I am the infinite reality, I am the eternal, the timeless. And so the mind takes not the words, it's not the concepts. The mind suddenly, because of its purity, understands the reality behind the concepts. And so the mind takes the form of the infinite Brahman. How does that happen? Well, that's a mystery. But the mind takes the form of the infinite Brahman, and that just as my mind takes the form of this room right now, and consciousness shining on that perception gives me the knowledge, I see the room, I know the room. So the mind takes the form of the infinite Brahman, and that is illuminated by the light of consciousness of the individual self. And the disciple knows, I am Brahman. Then, just as a cloth is burnt when the threads composing it are burnt, if you have a cloth and you burn the threads, you've burnt the cloth. So all the effects of ignorance are destroyed when their cause, namely ignorance, is destroyed. That is, through the mind taking the form of the infinite and then realizing I am Brahman, then ignorance is destroyed. That ignorance which caused all of our suffering, all of our pain, all of our limitation, that is destroyed. And just as when the threads of a cloth are destroyed, the cloth itself is destroyed, or when the cloth is destroyed, the threads also are destroyed. So when ignorance is destroyed, the products of ignorance, like the mind, are destroyed. Hence, the mental state of absolute oneness, which forms part of those effects, is also destroyed. As the light of a lamp cannot illuminate the luster of the sun, but is overpowered by it. When we take a lamp to illuminate the sun, it can't do it. It's overpowered by the light of the sun. So consciousness reflected in that state of mind is unable to illuminate the Supreme Brahman. So the mind takes the form of the Supreme Brahman, and the individual consciousness tries to illuminate it, but it is overpowered by it. And on the destruction of this state of absolute oneness with and on the destruction of this state of absolute oneness with which that consciousness is associated, there remains only the Supreme Brahman, identical with the individual self. Just as the image of a face in a looking glass, a mirror, is resolved into the face when the looking glass is removed. So you're seeing your face in a mirror, and when you remove the mirror, where did the reflection go? It remains here where it always was. This is the reality. This was just a reflection. So you take the mirror, the looking glass away, then the reflection remains as the face itself. There's nothing second to it. And so when the mind takes the form of Brahman, then that light of consciousness illuminates that, but then that is over, ignorance is destroyed thereby. But then that light of the individual consciousness is overpowered by the infinite light of the Supreme Self. And the Supreme Self alone remains. So that's speaking of the highest state, non-dual state of identity with Brahman, where there's nothing but Brahman remains, and you are that Brahman. So speaking of the highest state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi. So it's a very beautiful expression, one that needs a lot of deep thought if one wants to understand the intricacies of Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge. But let me now summarize just very briefly to say that knowledge as we generally use it means knowledge of things and knowledge of processes. Knowledge of the things and processes of this world. But in Vedanta, that is considered, yes, that level of knowledge is recognized, but that is considered the lower knowledge. The higher knowledge is that by which we know the infinite reality in direct experience, not as an object, but by identity. I am that, because it can't be objectified as an object. Yes, as I explained from the Vedanta Sara, the mind takes the form of Brahman, and in that sense, there's a slight objectification, which is illuminated by the individual consciousness, but that's immediately destroyed by the very impossibility of that actually taking place. So when the ignorance of Brahman is destroyed by that experience, then all of the products of ignorance, including the mind itself, are resolved into Brahman, and Brahman alone remains. And so, in Vedanta, the even lower knowledge is not separate from the higher knowledge, because in lower knowledge, I know this table, I know this watch, I know how to cook, I know how to walk, I know how to garden, and so forth. It's the knowing, the act of knowing, the light of consciousness illuminating the wave in the mind, the form of the mind which the things known take. That is the important part of knowledge. And from that standpoint, there's no difference in knowledge, only, as Swami Vivekananda says, a difference in degree between the knowledge of the infinite, where it's aha, and the knowledge of the lower, where there's a smaller aha. Oh, I understand. Yes, I understand. The experience is the same. One is in a small degree, the other is in an infinite degree. So all knowledge is the same. So knowledge in Vedanta, the important part of knowledge in Vedanta is the fact of knowing, the experience of knowing. But even that is limited by language, because we say the experience of knowing. So there's experience, and then there's knowing. No, there's no duality like that. That's because language by its very nature, thought by its very nature, which takes place in language, is dualistic. But the fact is non-dualistic. And so the fact of knowing, the fact of knowledge, is a non-dual fact. And all knowledge, as I said, is non-dual. Not the thing known, but the knowledge, the knowing itself. All knowing is non-dual. And so That's again why Swami Vivekananda says, with Vedanta, all knowledge is sacred. There's no difference between the knowledge of the infinite and the knowledge of physics. But that can only be understood from the standpoint of Vedanta. And that's why we see there's a great difference between an ordinary physicist and a knower of Brahman, because the physicist doesn't know what he or she is using is the same as that awareness of Brahman. So I'll stop here. I realize that this was a very abstract lecture. But in time, what happens in the spiritual path is we find that abstractions become more and more realities to us. Then they're not abstractions. They're abstractions in the sense that they're conceptual, just concepts without any tangible thing behind them. But in time, as we begin to get a feeling for these things, then they're no longer abstractions, because just as cup as a concept is an abstraction, but it refers to something I know, something I can touch, something I can use. So the concepts related to Brahman, to consciousness, to knowledge, then they start to become signifiers of actual experience. And so then they are not abstractions. So one part of if one wants to follow the path of knowledge, part of that path is turning abstractions into realities. And that is knowledge. So with that, I will end. I don't know, is there one question? Just read it out to me if you can, if it's simple enough.
From Gerald, it is how few words are related: information, knowledge, wisdom.
Now, what was the first one?
Information.
Oh, information, knowledge, and wisdom. Okay, very good. Yes, good. So I'm sorry if there are other questions. I'm already over time, so I won't take more, but I didn't want to leave off without taking at least one. So Jayanta's question, how are information, knowledge, and wisdom related? So information really refers to the things that are known. So information is the stuff that we know, and knowledge refers to awareness of these things. So information can be there without anyone having access to it, without anyone knowing it. You can find a book that's from long ago, published long ago, which deals with some obscure thing that everyone has forgotten about, something that nobody is aware of now, and you discover it and say, oh, wow, look at this. Somebody long ago discovered this thing and that we didn't even know about. So the information was there, but information just means facts that can be stored, facts that can be related to a mind, but which are stored. It's not we don't have to be conscious of it. Knowledge is the consciousness of that. I know all of that information. That is, I have read it, I've studied, I've processed it, and I understand it. So knowledge comes only when there's consciousness. Information doesn't need consciousness. It can be stored in a database or something. Knowledge, that which knows that information. And wisdom can be defined at different levels. Basically, in the most comprehensive sense, wisdom is that which knows the actual use of knowledge and information. Wisdom means not just knowing something and not just having information at hand, but it means one knows the value and the use and how this is related to the larger picture of life. So wisdom includes that which shows you what to do with information for the betterment of yourself and for others. Wisdom is always connected to goodness. Knowledge isn't. A very bad person can have a huge amount of knowledge, and information isn't. Information is just facts. But wisdom is always connected to knowing the proper use of something, how it relates to other things, that is, it fits into a more comprehensive picture, and knows the benefit of things and uses it for the good. So with that, I will close. Let me give announcements, and then I'll give a closing chant. So for announcements, on Tuesday, we'll have the usual Bhagavad Gita class at 7:30. On Thursday, we will have the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna class at 11 o'clock in the morning. And next Sunday, we'll have a lecture, but I've forgotten what subject I gave for next Sunday. So you'll have to look at the schedule either on the website or on the email that you got if you're on our mailing list. But there will be a lecture next Sunday. So with that, I'll give a closing chant. Om madhuvata ritayate madhuksharanti sindhava madhvirna santoshadhi madhunaktamutoshasi madhumatparthivagum rajaha madhudyaurastu nah pita madhumando vanaspatir madhumagumastu suryaha madhvirgavo bhavandunaha. Om Madhu, Om Madhu, Om Madhu. For us who seek the truth, and for all living beings, may the winds blow sweetly, may the rivers flow sweetly, may the herbs yield us sweetness. Sweet be the night and the break of day, sweet be the very dust of the earth. May the heavens pour down sweetness upon us. May the trees, lords of the forest, bear us sweetness. May the sun shed its sweetness upon us. May all the directions pour forth sweetness. Om, sweetness, sweetness, sweetness.